So you just bought your very first orchid, or it might be your 7th or 10th orchid, but you're still kind of unsure in terms of what to do to keep it happy, to keep it reblooming time and time again. Stick with me and let me show you what I do to keep mine happy and blooming. Hi, my name is Memo, this is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me, it's tropical houseplants. So for today's video, after a lot of requests from one of my most recent videos, people were kind of saying, do you maybe want to give us a bit of an overview as to what you do to keep your orchids happy? Now this video is going to be predominantly focusing on the type of orchid that you're seeing in front of me, which is the Phalaenopsis orchid, otherwise sometimes known as a moth orchid. But what I want to go into today is kind of a bit more about its structure, what I do to keep it happy, and what I've done in order to have most of my orchids blooming pretty much year-round at this point. So as I said, this is a Phalaenopsis orchid. This is also a Phalaenopsis orchid, or at least that is what it's being sold as. This is known as a mini Phalaenopsis orchid, or that's what you might see it in the shops, and this is a more traditional Phalaenopsis orchid. What I have seen, and this isn't necessarily coming from any scientific point of view, but from what I've noticed, especially based on some of my orchids, and for the purpose of this video, when I say orchids in this video, predominantly I mean the Phalaenopsis orchids. What I have noticed from my orchids is that there are 3 distinct sizes-ish, basically. So you get the mini Phalaenopsis orchids, then you get the kind of medium, kind of more run-of-the-mill Phalaenopsis orchids, which is what this one is. And then, unfortunately, that one is just coming into bloom now again, is what I would call the large bloomed Phalaenopsis orchid. So the blooms are considerably larger than the ones that you can see in front of me here. And whether or not they're different species, whether or not it's the same species and they're hybrids or they've been bred in that way, I do not know. But there are some differences amongst all 3 of them, other than just the bloom size. Now, let's talk about blooming. A lot of people probably want to know, how do I get my Phalaenopsis orchid to bloom or rebloom? Because a lot of the times when you're buying them in either supermarkets or even plant stores, garden centers, they usually come to you in bloom or at least in bud. And that is the point I'm trying to make here. And I will say this before anybody makes the comment in the video down below, this sells as a mini Phalaenopsis orchid. However, from some of the research that I've done and from things that people have told me, this might not actually be a Phalaenopsis orchid, regardless of what they're selling it under. If you know what this is actually called, do let us know in the comments down below. But the point I'm trying to make in terms of the size of the blooms is the mini Phalaenopsis orchid, pretty much most of my orchids, by the way, when I mention my orchids, I have owned them for between 8 or 10 years, depending. My oldest being 10 years, the kind of youngest, I think this might even be one of the youngest, is 8 years. This orchid has not stopped blooming or being in bloom pretty much since the day I got it. So and this is actually something that I've heard from a lot of other people when they're growing mini Phalaenopsis orchids, they are consistent bloomers. The medium size, or the kind of more around the mill, I've got it to the point where it's constantly blooming based on some of the tips that I'm going to give you in this video. But these bloom less frequently, or they're more hesitant than the mini that I was just showing you now. The large bloomed Phalaenopsis orchid, at least the one that I've got in my care, so I don't want to do a sweeping generalization, but in my experience with the one that I own, that one takes the longest between blooms. So just bear that in mind. So sometimes if you want to get one that's got absolutely huge blooms, it might mean that it's going to take that much longer to rebloom. However, the small one will be blooming for you constantly. Or at least that's been my experience and a lot of other people's experience. And I will caveat that to say with the mini Phalaenopsis orchids, the people that I know that I've spoken to don't have huge houseplant collections. These are just your average person who just happens to have an orchid that they bought or they were gifted, and they're managing to do this. So mini Phalaenopsis orchids, I would say if you're going to start and you're getting interested in getting some orchids, I would say actually start with the mini. The mini is a good place to start. But as I've got the big Mama Jamma in front of me, and I will give you a full view of this specific orchid, let's talk about some of its structures basically. And let's start actually off with how it's sitting, because at the moment it is in a cache pot, which is a decorative pot, in a clear pot. And you can see, or you should be able to see, all of the roots there that are in the pot. You might also be able to see at the top here, there are, and I don't know if there's a different word other than just roots for those at the top here, but they are what I would call kind of the equivalent of aerial roots. They are not meant to be in the growing media. And actually, whilst we're talking growing media, what is the growing media for a lot of Phalaenopsis orchids? At least here in the UK and in the EU, from what I have seen, predominantly they are sold grown in what people would call orchid bark. And that is kind of the general consensus of how you would get most Phalaenopsis orchids. I know, or at least I think, in the States and in other places of the world, you might purchase these plants with them being in something like damp sphagnum moss, and I'll get onto that in just a moment. But that is usually the growing media that they would have in there. You would have the roots in the bottom of the cache pot. I will lift it up again, so in the actual clear pot. Then you would have what I would call the aerial roots. If there is a more scientific name for these roots, I will add it somewhere at the top of the video. Then you would have the kind of leaves, which are very, very leathery and very, very thick. If you've never experienced a Phalaenopsis orchid or seen it up close, I'd be surprised, because they have become very commonplace these days. But if you haven't, these leaves are very, very succulent. That is probably the best way that I could describe them, is succulent. They are more like succulents in terms of their leaf than any other houseplant that you might get. Even some of the thickest leaves houseplants, this usually will take kind of pride of place as number one, basically. Then you would get these structures here, which are the flower spikes. Then you can sometimes get branching on the actual flower spike. So one flower spike will have multiple branches. Not always. A lot of the times what you might just get is one flower spike with the buds coming off it. So you can see the buds there, and those are little kind of blooms that haven't started to mature yet. You can see some that have opened there, and you can see some here that are kind of on the way to opening. And if I turn it around, you might be able to see some blooms that are slowly starting to swell, but they're not quite at the level yet of opening up into a bloom. So now that we've talked structure, and there's a reason why I started with structure, I think it's important to kind of know all the different parts of the plant, especially I am kind of predominantly talking to people that maybe are just coming into houseplants or orchids for the first time, or specifically Phalaenopsis orchids. As I said, there are slightly more advanced orchids, and I will touch on those at the very end. But it's good to kind of know the structures, because then you know what you kind of need to be addressing and when, basically. So let's talk about the flower spike, because for a lot of people, the reason why you would get something like an orchid is because you like the blooms. You would like to see the blooms as often as possible. I get that. However, the reality is, for a lot of the times, even with some of the tips that I'm going to tell you now, it's going to take a while for you to get them to the point where they are constantly blooming, and blooming quite frequently, or at least that has been my experience. Get used to seeing the leaves. The leaves are the thing that you're going to be seeing all of the time. The blooms are more sporadic, basically. And unfortunately for a lot of people, I don't think they realize this, because actually when the flower spikes are done and the blooms are spent and basically there's no blooms left on the plant, it's kind of a really blah looking plant to have around. Don't get me wrong, some people like it, and that's absolutely fine, but I think for the majority of people, these leaves don't necessarily excite them, basically. There are other orchids which are becoming slightly more kind of common. I think there's a Paphipetalum I think, and I'll kind of add the name up there, I can never kind of pronounce it properly, basically. Some of those you can get leaves with a checkerboard effect on them, basically. So the leaves have got a bit more interest than just being large, green, paddly leaves, basically. But yeah, the point I'm trying to make is get used to seeing the leaves, because you're going to be seeing that for a large period of the time. But you can get it to bloom a bit more frequently than even just once a year, basically. So let's talk about what you do if, for instance, you've bought an orchid and it was in bloom and the blooms have started to die off, or they have died off, basically. There's a few things that you can do. And one is to actually find something like a node, and I'll show you what a node looks like. So this bit here, these kind of elbowy bits, and you can see this little bump, that is a node. And what you would want to do, if it's still relatively green, and even if it doesn't have any of the blooms on there, you would go, okay, so that it had blooms all the way down to these branches. Maybe I wouldn't go for this one. I would cut above this node here. And there is a chance that from that node, you might get further branching and you might get another spike with more blooms happening there. It takes time. It won't be instantaneous, so bear that in mind. And it's not a guarantee. Because a lot of the times, if you start seeing something like, if you see that node there where what is covering the node essentially is a bit dry, or even if you start seeing this go a bit more woody and a bit browner, you're probably past the point where you can cut it and wait for it to kind of branch out. At that point, what you would want to do is go all the way almost to the last node that you can see and then cut above that. And you will see, like, I don't know if you can see here, that's an old flower spike that I cut down to the node. Maybe I left a bit too much of it appearing there, but eventually it does go quite dry and papery, and you can just remove it further. But this might be something that if you don't want to be seeing something this large, you might want to go a bit further down, basically. Now, the elephant in the room, and I will mention this because Sarah, the plant rescuer, loves Sarah, and I will link her down below. A lot of the times recently, she's kind of mentioned that, you know what, orchids do not need to be staked down with a janky sport stick. That's not how they would grow in nature. In nature, and I'm trying to do this without dropping everything down, they are epiphytes, so they would be attached somewhere to the side of a tree potentially. So they might be growing like this. The leaves might be cascading down, and the actual flower spikes would just hang down. But in terms of display, in terms of making these plants relatively easy to ship and a bit more of a wow factor, a lot of the growers will put them on spikes, but you don't have to. Now, this makes it quite interesting because what you can do is, say you've got a shelf somewhere quite high up and you don't have anything to put up there and you want something that kind of cascades down and shows a bit more interesting down, you could put this at the top, not stake it, and wait for the blooms to kind of cascade down. So the blooms will be down here, the leaves will be quite high up. What you will need to be aware of, and there's a reason why we're showing this to you in my conservatory, and this is a good kind of segue into the next topic, let's talk light. So light, and this is one of the big things that I found has a huge effect in being able to get these plants to rebloom as often as possible. I found, at least here in the UK, northern kind of Europe, bit more grey, all of these things, I treat my Phalaenopsis orchids almost as succulents and cacti. And by that, I mean in terms of their light. So I try to give them the brightest window that I have in my house, basically. The window that I know will do really well with things like aloe veras, things like cactus, succulents. This is where I will put this plant in, basically, and give it as much light as I possibly can, winter and summer. You might get some bleaching on the leaves, you might get some browning, you might get some crisping. That's something that you need to bear in mind, because just because one leaf is showing a bit of sign of distress, a lot of the times it doesn't make a difference to the blooms or even the overall health of the leaf. It just might mean that it's getting slightly sun-scorched. If it is and you don't like the look of it, just bring it in slightly further back from the window and that should solve the problem. Just don't go, okay, it's right up against the window, I'm going to move it 2-3 meters back. Just a touch back, and just keep moving it until you see that that burning no longer happens, but the plant is still getting that huge volume of light I found, at least, that it needs. And this applies to both the large orchids, the mini orchids and the extra large leafed ones as well. So that is something to bear in mind. And the more light you can kind of expose them to, the better. There is a slight caveat here because I do have family that lives in warmer locations. So my parents live in Greece and Cyprus for most of the year. And my mother has always tried to grow orchids, unsuccessfully trying to get them to rebloom. And even though I have told her what I do, does she listen? No. And then she still complains they don't grow. And I'm just like, can you at least try? You asked for the advice. We gave you the advice. Can you at least try? Okay, fine then. The no patience and the stubbornness I get from my mum, basically. So we are one and the same person. Love her to bits, but yes, we're both stubborn. So this is the thing with these plants, is that they need as much light as possible. If, however, you're in a very, very bright location, so that's why I was using Greece and Cyprus as an example, it could be somewhere a bit more dry, a bit more bright and sunny. I'm thinking not Northern Europe, basically, further south. Then having this in your brightest window might be a bit too much light for them. Again, what I would say is start it in that window, but maybe start it a couple of like 1 or 2 meters further back in that situation, because the light's going to be too intense and going to be on them all day long. So adjust accordingly based on where you are. And now I want to touch on temperature fluctuations, which is something that a lot of people don't always talk about. It's not 100% necessary, and it will happen by default, I find, a lot of the time. Most of my Phalaenopsis orchids go gaga in the spring, autumn, and winter more so than they do in the summer. I still get blooms in the summer as well, but I find that they are much more willing to provide me with the blooms in the autumn, spring, and winter as well. I had to think there. And part of that is I think that they do like a bit of temperature fluctuation. And what you will get by having these orchids quite close to a window, it doesn't matter how thick your windows are, at some point there's going to be a bit more coldness coming towards these plants, especially if they're quite close to the window. And at night, especially during these darker months of the year, that temperature will drop a bit. And for a lot of other houseplants, that's a bit of an issue. For the orchids, they do tend to like this. And again, it links back to where they might be growing naturally. So you're kind of emulating what they would experience in their natural habitat. Always a good thing, means happy orchids, basically. So that is something that if you can achieve, that's why I'm saying try to give them as much light as possible, have them close to the window, because then you get the benefit of that cold snap as well in the winter. Now let's talk about water and fertilizing. Let's do both, basically. So what is my routine with my plants, basically? And most of my plants, I will be a bit more strategic with them, as in I will kind of have a schedule when to check them and water them, but my orchids are on a schedule of when they get watered, basically. And that hasn't changed in 3 different properties, basically. So what I would do is, you can see there's a pot in a cache pot, and what I would do is take my fertilizer, and let me put this down and show you the fertilizer that I use for my orchids. And for the people that have been here for a lot of my other videos when we talk about regular houseplants, I do not use this for anything but my orchids. I will use Baby Bio orchid food, and that is what we can get in the UK, but this has been super good in my experience. I am sure 100% in your own kind of country, wherever you're based, you probably have got other companies that do orchid food. Get that. A lot of people might ask me, what about the spray orchid food? I tried it, granted not so much. I bought it for my Hoyas, not for my orchids. I tried it on both. Did I see a huge difference? Personally, no. I know other people have, but personally no, which meant I gave up on that. Still using the liquid food, basically. So what I would normally do is I would have the pot, and I will kind of take the top off and then just drip 2, 3, 4, 5 drops directly onto the roots. And that's not best practice, but the reason why I do that is I usually do it where I'm going to like fill it up with water, and then what I will do is fill up, as the pot is in the decorative pot, I will fill it all up with water up to the very tippy top, basically. And that would mean that obviously where I'm putting the water, it would be where I drop the drops, so it does dilute it, basically. And what I will do then is leave, and I do this for all my orchids at the same time, I will just leave them to basically stew in that water with the fertilizer in for 20 to 30 minutes. Do not go for much longer. Yes, if you forget and you go back in a couple of hours, will it cause too much of an issue? Probably not. If you forget it there for days on end, don't come for me, basically, because then you might be dealing with root rods. But that is a good way. I mean, just put them down, set a timer, go about your day, and then just come back when the time is up. And then all you would do is take this off, put it somewhere where it can drain, like over a sink or something, wait for it all to drain out, and then just tip the rest of the water. Ooh, there was some left in there. Tip the rest of the water out, pop it back in, and as we say in the UK, Bob's your uncle, you're all good, basically. Put it back on the windowsill, you're done. That is the care. There's nothing else exciting about it, basically. That is it. Bright light, a window that might get a bit cold in the winter, pulling in water with fertilizer and letting it stew for a bit. And that should be all that you would need to do. And after a while, when your plants get used to this routine, they will start blooming more frequently. One final point that I want to make is water. So you might be asking, in terms of water, what kind of water do I do? Anything special with the water other than just the fertilizer? No, tap water straight out of the tap. I know some people just like go for slightly lukewarm water. I've never done that with my orchids. It's as cold as the cold water comes out of the tap. Granted, we don't go super freezing cold even in the UK in the winter, so it's not arctically icy cold, basically. So there is that to remember. If that was the case, then maybe I would make it a bit lukewarm by adding a touch of warm water in it. But it's fine. Out of the tap, it's fine. It doesn't need reverse osmosis water. It doesn't need things like rainwater. The benefits of doing something like reverse osmosis or rainwater, and I don't find that a lot of my orchids necessarily need this. And I mean, I know this one's got some browning on the leaves, but again, as I said, this one went through some root rot, and some of those were the leaves that it had when it was still struggling with root rot. The newest leaves are completely fine and healthy. What you might get with the slightly better quality water like rainwater or reverse osmosis water is you might not get any browning at the tips of the leaves, because essentially that's what that ultra pure water does. It doesn't have any minerals or as many minerals. If it's rainwater, it probably won't have any. If it's reverse osmosis, it probably doesn't have any, or very, very minute amounts in, not enough for the plant at the very tippy tops of their leaves. Because if you think about it like kind of capillaries that we might have kind of in our circulatory system, so those tiny blood vessels at the very end of like your fingers and stuff like that is what they would have at the very end of their leaves, which means that if there's something like minerals, it's a lot easier for those minerals to get stuck at those kind of very tippy points, those kind of capillary ends, and that's where you would get sometimes that browning, basically. But other than that, watering is quite normal, basically. Now, let's talk about a few other things that you can do to promote blooming or that will assist in more frequent blooming. So I don't know if you can see this. So this might not seem like it, but this is a relatively established plant. As I said, 8 to 10 years. And that is something to bear in mind as well. The more mature the plant is, the more robust it's going to be, the more used to your conditions, your care, all of the above. So did I manage to get them to bloom quite frequently, quite early on? Yes. Did it still take a few months to up to a year? Yes. I still managed to get them to rebloom within that year, but not as frequently as they would be blooming now. The other thing I will say, and I'll bring up the pot again so you can see a bit closer. Can you see the slight bluey kind of grey cast on these roots? And it's kind of glaucous, that's the word for it. This is when the plant, or at least the root, hasn't had water with it recently. What you might be able to see, if I bring it in a bit closer, you can see through the clear pot that those roots, which these plants got watered 2 days ago, basically, and that should tell you something. These roots are still wet. So you can see they're much more green than this glaucousness here. And it might be a bit more daunting in the beginning when you're first starting off, but you will start recognizing it relatively quickly. There is definitely a color difference. I don't think it's coming up as much as I would like it to on camera, but there is a color difference. So that will tell you that that's been watered. If you go to water them, don't just do what I do and just go there every week, same day, and water them. Have a look at the roots. I know that at 7 days, my roots have gone this bluey color in the pot. Not talking about the ones up here, not the aerial roots, but the ones in the actual pot. Then I would say you're good to water. If they are still green, maybe wait for another day. Check it again the next day and check it again the next day. Wait until these are no longer that kind of greeny color, which means that they are still wet, and then water it basically. Now, a couple of requests, or one request more specifically, and I know some people have had success with this, and I'm sure they will tell me down in the comments below. Please, 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 for all that is holy, do not put ice cubes on top of your orchids. Here, I get the theory behind why people kind of have said to do this, because technically the ice will melt slowly, but again, if we're being real, have you seen an ice cube melt? It doesn't take that long. It just takes half an hour basically. It's usually all melted at that point. However, you can shock the roots. These are tropical plants. When have you ever seen snow and ice in a tropical location? They're not used to it, so it could really shock the roots and cause you further issues down the line, basically. So bear that in mind. Now, the other thing that I wanted to talk about is repotting. And now repotting is something, and I'm showing you this one because this one pretty much had some root rot 6 months ago. Ta-da! That's not a problem. So I've had to repot it basically, but what I can do, so I've got a pot that I've added holes into, but these are kind of orchid pots. Do you need to do this? No, I just added these to this specific pot because this had the root rot, just to speed it up a bit more. Do you need to do it? No, it might just take a bit longer basically. And you can see that their roots are already starting to kind of occur in here. And I will show you the other pot for comparison. And you might be able to see just the level of blooms that this one has, and can you even see any substrate through the roots? Probably not. And you might see some blackness that's happening. Is there some rot that's happening down here with this specific root? Yes. Do I remove it? Sometimes. For these types of plants. Different when it's a different house plant. But I don't find it's always necessary basically with the orchids. What I will do, however, is, and this is the real crux of the matter when it comes to repotting, what I will do is when it's kind of time to repot it, and I usually do this every year or every 2 years, usually I lean more towards the 2 years. Usually it will be a situation like this, and a lot of people, what they might do is, oh, the plant is growing, I need to give it a bigger pot. Step away from the bigger pot, at least in my experience. And again, this is more of a old wives' tale, but I have found that there is some merit to it. And what I mean by that is take it out of the pot when you're repotting, remove whatever growing media is in there that's probably a bit kind of like disintegrating by this point. Put new of the same growing media if you can. So if it was in bark, put it back in bark. If it was in sphagnum moss and you've been able to keep it happy in sphagnum moss, maybe still put it in bark. But if you want to, you can go with sphagnum moss and keep it in the same exact pot. The reason for this, and a lot of the blooming plants, at least what my experience has been, is, and this is not scientifically proven in any way or form, but if you keep them slightly root bound so that they don't have a huge amount of space in the pot, then what you tend to find is that they will bloom much more readily for you. They have done, at least in my experience, and it kind of makes sense. It's essentially the plant going, oh my god, there's not a lot of space, I think I'm going to die. Bloom, 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 so I can pass my genetics through pollinators to other plants. So it gives it that kind of signal. Does it stress out the plant? Not specifically. Years, absolutely fine, basically. But it does mean that you will get more blooms because of it. And this doesn't apply just for orchids, by the way. This will apply to a lot of your blooming houseplants. Same thing will apply as well in the garden. Recently, I was planting in a fig tree for edible figs. And one of the things that they were saying, if you're going to put it in the ground, put some slates around or something to kind of block the roots from kind of expanding too quickly, because all you're going to get is a whole bunch of lush leafy growth, but no blooms, thus no fruit. So for a lot of times with a lot of our houseplants, that's not an issue. We're growing them for the foliage. I don't know a lot of people that will grow a Phalaenopsis orchid for the foliage. They are growing it for the blooms, so same principle applies. Keep it a bit more bound and you should be fine. But yeah, generally speaking, none of my orchids have moved into bigger pots since the day I got them. Now you might be asking, are they susceptible to many pests? Generally speaking, at least in my experience, and most of these are growing in regular household conditions for me, no, I've not really had many issues. I know I have heard of people that do occasionally get the odd mealybug, maybe thrips, maybe. I don't think I've ever had spider mites on there. I mean, none of these things means it's impossible for these plants to get them. It just means that I haven't seen them. And for me, these are some of the most, not pest repellent plants for me, but pests insensitive plants, if that makes sense. So there's not that many pests that would necessarily attack them in my condition, in my care. Yours might be entirely different, but I'm just telling you what I've experienced. But let's talk about some more kind of advanced orchids, just to kind of wrap this up, and you might be able to kind of see a bit more of it, basically. So I'm not going to bring them all down. I've got them up on the wall and I have got them mounted. I do have a video, however, that I should be able to put here, and you should see some of my wall mounted orchids. The 3D printed mounts that I use are from one of the lovely viewers on here, North, and I will see about finding North's business website and put it down below if you want to buy your own, basically. But this way of growing is very good for plants like orchids that are not as common as the kind of Phalaenopsis orchid that we were just looking at a moment ago. So what they are is just basically a simple mount. You don't even have to do these fancy that I've done with the 3D printed ones. You can find another way to mount it. Damp sphagnum moss around the roots. But the difference with those, and at least what I've experienced with my more advanced orchids, at least what I'm calling advanced orchids, is that sphagnum moss dries out super quickly. Even in here in my conservatory, where the average humidity is between 70 and 80% most of the time, those get watered every 2, 3, or 4 days, even now in the winter. In the summer, they might be getting watered as frequently as every 2 days. So I know what a lot of people might do with their orchids, and this is falling into kind of orchid fanatic territory, and I'm not in that category just yet. If you are somebody who's grown loads of stunning orchids for years, and you've got a different way of doing things, do let us all know down below. But I would imagine what would probably happen is all these mounts that they might have indoors in the winter might go outdoors, somewhere like a shaded part of a greenhouse or something that's not super, super bright, because bright indirect light in the house is very different in the garden, where the light is directly above and there's nothing to kind of like shelter these plants. A lot of the times the bright indirect light plants in the house, in the garden, are shade plants. So bear that in mind. So kind of a shaded location, somewhere like a greenhouse or anything like that, put it up there or put it up against a wall underneath a tree or something, and then maybe what they would do then is just water them with a hose as they're watering their garden every day or two, basically, in the summer. And that probably makes the process a lot easier. And when it comes to the more kind of advanced orchids, you'll get some more interesting blooms. You can go ham with it, basically. I'm not going to bore you with all the different types you can get on Oncidiums. You can get, I don't think Cattleyas are even that much of a advanced orchid, but you can get things like Brassavolas or Brassavola hybrids. You get into a whole world of hybrids, interesting blooms, bloom shapes, bloom colors. They don't all look the same that you might get with a Phalaenopsis orchid bloom. A lot of my advanced orchids, I tend to lean and gravitate towards scented orchids, because if you've never experienced a scented orchid, oh, wow. Hopefully on the video you might be able to see one orchid that doesn't look particularly interesting. It's a bit grassy, it's got some bulbs on it. It's called the coconut pie orchid. Oh, the name is entirely correct. That's obviously the common name. There is a scientific name. But it does, when I'm growing it in here and it's in bloom, oh, I come into here and it just smells. And it's interesting because it doesn't just smell of coconut. There are notes in the scent of that kind of pie smell as well, like that kind of pastry smell. It smells divine. So don't be snoozing on the fragrant orchids. The other thing I will say, and I didn't know this until recently, there are, I think, some versions of Phalaenopsis, not the ones usually that you will ever get in the shops, but I don't know if there's specific species or hybrids that are scented. And I think a lot of the original kind of Phalaenopsis that they might have been hybridizing in the beginning could have been scented, and it's easier to ship. There's less of an issue if people don't like the smell, so they kind of leaned towards selecting orchids that were unscented for that reason. But if you are a fan of scents, see if you can find some of that online. You probably won't find it in your average supermarket or garden center, but very cool nonetheless to discover. But I think I have prattled on for far too long. Hopefully this was useful and entertaining. If you've got your own tips and tricks on what you do to get kind of consistent blooming on your orchids or to keep them happy year round, if at all possible, do drop them down below. I would love to see them, as well as I would imagine everybody else watching this video would. And yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon. And I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.